thank you for the kind introduction earlier. And I'd also like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak and share some views on green finance and carbon pricing. But before I begin, I also want to especially thank each of the speakers who spoke before me, Chandra, Siddharth, Deepa, and Gurudas, for sort of reminding us that there's so many different facets to understanding the challenges that India faces when it comes to addressing the climate challenge that we face collectively, not just as a nation, but as one nation among many globally. So let me just begin by sharing my screen. Give me a second, please.
Sure.
Is this visible?
It will be, yes, it is visible.
Right. Right, let me begin. Right, so very briefly, CEEW is among Asia's leading think tanks, leading policy research institutions, and we have 7 focus areas, as well as a dedicated Center for Energy Finance, which is where I work. Right, I think some sort of context setting or some perspective is very useful before we begin. And I'd like to highlight 3 points when it comes to context setting and perspective. The first is that green finance in India has largely been driven, or to a large extent has been driven by rapid renewables, which is solar and wind deployment. What this means from a climate finance lens is more mitigation, less adaptation. And from a sustainability financing lens, it means a bigger focus on SDGs 7 and 13, which pertain to affordable and clean energy as well as climate action. The second point is that COVID-19 put a sharp focus on green in India as well as internationally. And finally, the big questions, what is exactly going to drive green finance going forward? Near term, it's possibly going to be India's NDC pledges at COP26 for 2030. Long term, it could be India's net zero pledge, again at COP26 for 2070. There's also the sharper green lens on corporates. This is both voluntary as well as coming from regulatory pushes, as well as adaptation, which is the big question mark, which some of the other speakers also spoke about earlier. Right, just because renewables has been such a big linchpin or driver green finance, it's useful, I think, to just step back and primarily of installed variable solar and wind resource means that from a share of nationwide generation perspective, which is actually what we should be looking at, the percentages are slightly different. I've given you from the last quarter 3 data points, the average, high and low. The average is just short of 10%, but on certain days it's as high as 12.6. And again, remember this is for the last quarter, or the previous quarter, which was actually not a very high generation quarter for renewables in the first place. But if we add 46 gigawatt of hydro to the 105 gigawatt, it looks much, much better. And after all, hydro is green. Share of nationwide installed capacity, almost 40%, actually it's 39%. And if we look at share of generation, just look at the average number, it's 20%. So a lot of us may not realize, but as a country as a whole today, when we turn on, our light bulbs, put on our ACs, put on whatever it is that works on electricity, on average, about 20%, at least in the last quarter, was coming from renewables and hydro. On certain days, such as October 18th, 2021, it was actually as high as 27%. So really, this impressive progress, particularly because a lot of focus is on green, has come considering that, India's national solar mission was launched just a bit over 10 years ago in 2010. So, we've actually become from negligible solar, then practically zero, to becoming the world's 5th largest solar market. Right. The second point I said was, that COVID-19 put a sharp focus on green, almost immediately after it. And I just got four sort of sample news items or developments that I've just picked up. And from clockwise top left, it's from March, July, September, and October 2020. Starting with the first one from March 2020, we found at CEEW that in the immediate aftermath of the first lockdown, RE was actually, that's renewables, was actually the least impacted as a generation source. Moving on, it didn't take too much time for Tesla to overtake Toyota and become the world's most valuable car maker in terms of market capitalization. In July, Tesla actually crossed Toyota. By October, it was worth 2 times Toyota. And by the way, today, Tesla is worth about 3 times Toyota. And closer home in India, by September, Adani Green, which has a fraction of generating capacity compared to NTPC, actually crossed NTPC in terms of market capitalization. Today, Adani Green is worth 2.3 times NTPC. And finally, in October 2020, the green bond issuances actually crossed the collective $1 trillion mark, and that's $1 trillion since they were first issued in the mid-2000s. So, this immediate positive push for green in the aftermath of COVID-19 also manifested in India and continued well into 2021. And I'm going to look at this from 3 perspectives. The first is policy. The second is diversity in capital raising or the sources of capital. And the third is more in terms of looking at supply chain and business decarbonization. So from a policy perspective, clearly some of the speakers very importantly pointed out the hydrogen story in India is fast emerging. Can we expect something similar as what happened in solar? As I mentioned, yes, in the previous slide, it was just 10 years ago, a bit over 10 years, that national solar mission was launched. Can we imagine something like this happening for hydrogen as well? We're seeing increased innovation in tender design to ease integration of renewable power. So, round-the-clock power, renewables, bundling renewables with thermal, assured peak power supply, and hybrids. Third, there's also a big push for domestic manufacturing, and this cuts across storage, solar PV, and hydrogen value chains. There's also been, moves on the margins, I would say, but very important margins such as redesign of renewable energy certificates. And as well as waivers of interstate transmission charges, which I think are very important enablers. But it remains to be seen how and to what extent DISCOMs actually help facilitate these type of mechanisms. Secondly, from a diversity in capital sources perspective, India's low carbon transition attracted capital in record volumes, I would say, in 2021. The international green bond market, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, but it was the international green bond market, not so much the domestic green bond market, was very robust. We saw M&A transactions, we saw appetite for broader low carbon investments, as well as forward-looking sustainability bond issuances. And again, just looking at this, some sort of sample news items from 2021, clockwise from top left. In Feb 21, we had India's first sustainability-linked bond. So, sustainability-linked bonds are different from green bonds. Green bonds are certified as such based on the end use of the capital that will be raised. Sustainability-linked bonds typically look at the company raising them to achieve certain milestones going forward. So anyhow, the first sustainability-linked bond from India in 2021 came in Feb. Adani Electricity followed very quickly with its own multi-billion-dollar sustainability-linked bond program, of which 300 million was raised. And bottom right, from August 21, we ourselves at CEEW actually released a report which tracked every single green bond issuance by Indian developers since 2014. And we found that more money had been raised in the first 6 months of 2021 by Indian developers overseas than in any previous calendar year. And finally, we saw a lot of robust activity in terms of value, at least, in the RE space. And then finally, the third thing I want to talk about was supply chain and business decarbonization. There's obviously been a push for domestic manufacturing, and this has opened up supply chain investment opportunities. And very importantly, corporates themselves are increasingly pursuing carbon neutrality. The topic of SEBI mandating BRSR reports for the top 1,000 listed companies was brought up by an earlier speaker. I think that's very important. But on the other side, I think there's also a voluntary push towards carbon neutrality, because I think companies have figured out that it's a smart thing to do to show green credentials. And again, I won't spend too much time on going through each of these headlines, but I'll move on to COP26. So moving on to COP26, before I get into India, it's useful to sort of take a look at what really happened from a big picture perspective. There was net zero announcements leading up to and at COP26, both by developed countries as well as developing countries. There was the historic mention of phase down of unabated coal and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. There was increasing alignment of private capital, very, very important because private capital is critical. GFANZ, which is 450 banks and financial institutions representing a collective $130 trillion of assets under management. But against all this, inadequacy of climate finance flows to developing countries. And remember, climate financing flows are not grants or gifts. They're just absolute numbers, absolute values of flows, some of which come on market terms and some of which come on concessional terms. Right. So what did India do at COP26? So in a nutshell, what India did was it upsized on some previous commitments, and it also newly committed on new things. So the first two rows talk about the upsizing of previous commitments, and the first column or the second column, which is the one in the middle, is specifically highlights what India had committed for COP21 in Paris, and the last column looks at what India committed per Glasgow. So really, the first thing that was upsized was the share of non-fossil fuel capacity. The previous target was 40%, and that's been raised to 50%. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, India is already at 39%, so not a big surprise that this was raised. The second target that was upsized was the emissions intensity reduction, which previously was 33 to 35%. It's been raised to 45%. Again, not a big surprise because BOR3 already highlights that a 24% reduction has been achieved. And that brings us to the new pledges. The first new pledge was India actually quantified that by 2030, we'd want to have 500 gigawatt of non-fossil fuel-based electricity capacity. Remember, India has mentioned this in domestic settings. Previously, it was 450 of RE, and this is the first time it actually went on an international stage and mentioned 500 gigawatt by 2030. There was also a reduction in emissions. Actually, this is against a BAU pathway. And finally, the net zero year. And I think I've highlighted in red the two sort of commitments that really beg the question, well, how much is this going to cost? And capital really does lie at the heart of this challenge, because whether we look at it from a 2030 perspective or whether we look at it from a 2070 perspective, the amount of capital that can be reasonably raised or is being raised today or is being mobilized is falling short. So looking at it from a 2030 perspective, I'm just going to read out a point made by the Standing Committee on Energy, which tabled its report on financial constraints in the RE sector just a few weeks ago in both houses of parliament, which says that our long-term RE commitments require between 1.5 lakh to 2 lakh crore annually, which is 27 billion. Against this, actual investments in the last few years have been around 75,000 crores, so 10 billion. So half of what is actually required. Now, if you look at it from a net zero by 2070 perspective, again, CEEW actually came out with a report that just a few weeks after COP26, which quantified what it would take, and that number is 10.1 trillion. Now, I won't get into too much detail on this because I'll talk about it in the following slides. But really what this means is, we need more money than is flowing today, and that can be reasonably sourced from conventional sources. Breaking down this net zero number a little bit into detail, because that always catches everybody's eye because it's trillions, not just billions or millions. I'll just draw your attention to the last row, which is total. So the big finding was that we would require, remember, these numbers are not just for 1 year, this is for 50 years from 2020 to 2070. The big finding was that we would require $10.1 trillion in terms of capital to invest in the power, industry, and mobility sectors to achieve net zero. A lot of it, by the way, and again, this was highlighted by speakers earlier, and this is, totally agree with them. a lot of it can actually be mobilized from conventional sources, both domestic and international. So about 6.5 of it can be mobilized from conventional sources. There is a gap of 3.5 trillion, but we also feel that it's not as if India is seeking this as a gift, but some sort of capital which comes in on concessional terms or concessional support can actually mobilize that investment gap. And then finally, moving on again from what happened, right after COVID hit, what happened in 2021, and moving beyond COP26, just look at what happened with the budget speech and the budget announcements. Climate action and energy transition were highlighted in the first few minutes of the finance minister's budget speech. A capex outlay of 7.5 lakh crores, this is about $100 billion, was announced, which again is notably 35% above the current year's number. And this is really important because greening, as I highlighted in my previous slide, requires hard infrastructure on the ground, and capital expenditure is precisely what is required to fund it. But of course, the big question is how much of the 100 billion will actually make its way to green. And the third point was, of course, the announcement of the intention of GOI to issue sovereign green bonds. As I mentioned earlier, the corporate green bond market, of course, this is overseas green bonds. Overseas issuances by Indian developers has been very strong. By the end of the year of 2021, actually, Indian developers had raised 5.1 billion, which is again, just obviously since the 6-month number was more than any previous calendar year, it's obvious that the full year number would also be more than any previous calendar year. But the big challenge is, of course, that the domestic corporate green bond market remains lackluster. So can sovereign bonds catalyze that? And finally, I want to touch upon the topic of carbon pricing in a very limited way, because again, as another speaker highlighted, it's not something that really exists today. But in a way, a kind of carbon market does exist in India in the form of renewable energy certificates. RECs allow buyers to purchase the zero carbon attributes of RE. But there are some things that merit consideration and pointing out. The first is the mirror image of an REC is a renewable purchase obligation, or RPO. It mainly extends to discoms. Companies and industries are exempt from this obligation. Secondly, while we at CEEW counted almost 1.24 billion, which is quite a big number of RECs having been sold on the exchanges, if all the obligations were to be enforced, the supply of RECs would actually not be enough. And thirdly, it only decarbonizes emissions which relate to electricity. So you need a broader market which captures, which reflects the emissions from not just electricity but the balance 60%. And as India develops, there will be overachievers and those that don't meet standards when it comes to emissions. And a mechanism that rewards the former and nudges the latter is a really important policy lever. And that brings me to my conclusion. And I just want to highlight a few things and capture a few of the elements of what I spoke about earlier. And perhaps I think some of what the other speakers may have also mentioned. The first is that the climate crisis is not specific to any country, but it's global in nature. Second, in India, there are 3 transitions that are taking place in parallel, but at different phases of evolution. There's the energy transition, which is the shift to renewables. There's the mobility transition, which is a shift to electric vehicles. And there's a hydrogen transition, which has the potential to deeply decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. And I think real transformation will happen only when these 3 transitions actually intersect. So right now they're in parallel at different phases, but at some point they're going to intersect. And to a large extent, the technologies that are required for each of the 3 transitions actually exist today. And capital, to my mind, emerges as the principal challenge. And as I said earlier, a lot of the capital, most of it, in fact, can actually be mobilized internally, but some measure of international support is definitely required to bridge the gap. So that is it from my side. Thank you very much.